And this is kind of a hidden benefit of cloud computing, if we go back to the other slide for a second, is because I'm talking to the cloud through a secure channel, if I have a sales rep who's on the road, and that sales rep wants to access company proprietary information, or even see displays from company proprietary applications that are web-enabled, they can do that through Salesforce without using VPN. Because you're connecting into the cloud environment. My cloud environment has a secure connection back to the data center, so people now can access information that is company proprietary using the security controls inside of Salesforce without having to go and establish a VPN back to the company. Now, the implication of that for your sales reps and for the IT department is pretty broad. It makes it a lot easier to connect, and it means you're going to have a lot fewer reliability problems on the road. Anyone who's ever tried to use VPN from a hotel knows that it often doesn't work. By moving to the cloud, you're escaping that, but you're bringing your information with you. So that's another benefit of that integration appliance approach. But what usually happens on the integration appliance is we never want to have one of anything. So you know, Salesforce being a multi-tenant environment, there's lots of places and ways we can connect into it. So normally we have at least two different connection engines to be able to facilitate. We'll set it up so that you have failover in the internal environment. If one integration engine is down, we connect to the other one, regardless of what product that is. Both of them have secure external connections, and the integration engines can be set up so that they behave as part of your infrastructure. So for example, you have SNMP messaging. If you've got centralized management for managing disasters and recovery in your data center, network management, the integration appliances talk to that environment. So if something does fail, you'll be alerted. You can initiate recovery procedures, and you can gain that kind of enterprise reliability. When is it appropriate to use what kind of appliance is a question we're often asked. Something like a cast iron appliance, which is actually a physical piece of hardware, is usually good for about 1 million records an hour. So we find if you're doing, for example, a lot of real time, if you have a contact center or you're communicating and loading sales information, if you're doing order to cash, it's very suitable for that kind of environment. If you're communicating with a large ODS, if you're moving information into a data store, or you're pushing things from a data store into Salesforce, that's where you really get some big advantages with Informatica. So depending on the volume of data and the complexity of the transformations, it will help you decide what appliance. But redundant environments can be set up with both of them. Now this one we call a myth, but this one has a little bit of a grain of truth to it. For those of you who have worked in large cloud environments, can I scale my integration to support the enterprise? What happens when I'm dealing with large volume of data? Here the answer is in architecture. Application design is really critical to make sure you can deal with large data volumes. There are some restrictions in the cloud environment as to how many records I can push in and how quickly. Correctly architecting the solution helps us work around those. There are also products on the market that can help us bypass some of those limitations. So a lot of the analytics products that people are accustomed to working to, if people have worked with tools like Cognizant or business objects, those have basically special integration interfaces on their own that will allow you to move higher volumes of data. Also, there are some Force.com application extenders. For example, people who work in life sciences, vInsights from Veeva is a life sciences analytics engine that's integrated with Force.com, but has its own landing pad for pushing in large volumes of prescriber data. So there's a lot of ways that we can look at different products in the marketplace and an architectural approach to minimize the impact of large data volume. But this one, there's no dancing around it. It does take a little bit of planning to manage large data volumes. In fact, if you check your schedules, you'll find tomorrow that Salesforce has a technical workshop on managing large data volumes in a Force.com environment. So I also think if you're interested in that, or if that's a challenge for you, that's also a session that's worth attending. The other thing is, people say, it's time consuming. We talked about it a little bit before, is integration kills my projects. It's what's going to eat up my time. What we found is by taking the appliance approach, number one is we can take advantage of pre-built connectors. Number two, we're working in a click and build environment. So traditional work that we do, doing data mapping, looking at transformations, looking at data stewardship, who's going to own information, how are we going to transform it, how are we going to clean it. These traditional parts of any project still occur. What doesn't occur in the cloud environment is we're going to eliminate a lot of the coding. By looking at some of these on-demand tools, we can go to a click and build environment. You can literally drag and drop. Instead of writing code, I can look at the fields in one environment, the fields in another, and graphically describe the transformations for the fields. So that's going to make it a lot easier and really eliminates the development work out of the process. So the work really becomes defining the requirements and doing proper data mapping. So those traditional things, which you're probably already accustomed to doing today, you still have to do. Now, some people can say, oh, well, it's cloud computing, I'll just turn it on in 2 weeks. Not in an enterprise environment, that's not true. Our average enterprise Salesforce project is probably on the order of 6 to 9 months. Still faster than many traditional CRM platforms, but there is more traditional work that has to happen here. I'll give you another example. We have a life sciences customer that has a large prescriber database. There are hundreds of gigabytes moving back and forth in and out of the cloud environment. And the way they're doing that is by architecting it in two ways. One is that a lot of the sources of the data are actually coming from some of the other vendors they work with that are providing these services from the cloud. This information comes into an internal data warehouse. We've written some applications there that do the data transformation. And for this particular customer, they're using vInsight from Viva, which has its own landing pad for analytics. We're pushing the data directly out there. So what's actually going into the Salesforce environment are basically all the records that help them establish these connections, but we're not pushing a large data volume directly into there. Rather, it's going into another cloud environment. And that's kind of the similar process that you follow when you start looking at business objects or Cognos or some of the other analytics tools out there on the network. So we're avoiding the large volume problem by using different tools and taking a different approach to it. One of the other things that we also tell people is, when we're looking at integration, the question is, should you integrate? How much integration should I choose? So if you're looking at integration, this is a question you definitely need to be asking. Right? You need to strike a balance between customization and integration. And a lot of people, especially if people here grew up around a large CRM platform, I worked for many years with Siebel myself, and we always said, customization is a bad word. You don't want to customize your application. You don't want to do development in that interface. Every time you customize it, you're shooting yourself in the foot, because the next time you do an upgrade, well, now you usually have to rewrite those customizations, or you have to do lots of testing. So what we tend to do is we try to put as much data outside the application as we can. We build a complex integration environment. With Salesforce, I think best practice is a little bit different approach. First of all, you shouldn't be afraid to customize in the Salesforce environment. Customization doesn't carry the overhead that it does in some of these other large CRM platforms. The other thing, though, is that where you will run into problems is if you do a lot of UI customization. So if you stay within the standard Salesforce screen rendering, you tend to get a lot of advantages and not a lot of penalties. Where I would be looking to minimize customization is, if you're building a lot of Visualforce pages, Visualforce is kind of built the old-fashioned way. We're going to go and we're going to write some code and we're going to test it. So the more Visualforce you do, potentially, that's going to have some overhead when you go through and have to build your application. But if you're staying within the standard UI, you can customize that and not worry about it. You heard Mark Benioff this morning talk about 5-minute upgrades. Right? You don't have the big upgrade penalty that you used to have with traditional client-server CRM. So by leveraging, number one, building more functionality into the application, and number two, also leveraging the App Exchange. You'll find a lot of pre-built applications there have a lot of functionality already built. And by incorporating that, again, you're going to eliminate, in some cases, the need to have these things outside. You can move your territory management inside the application. In some cases, you can move your customer master information inside the application. So making decisions about what's going to be in and what's going to be out can also make a difference in your integration. And we don't usually think about projects in that way. We often think about, let's define the business requirements, then we're going to figure out where the data is, then we're going to create an integration plan. But when you're looking at a cloud implementation, if you start by looking at what functionality is going to reside here, maybe I just need to access the application interface. Maybe I don't need to pull the data into Salesforce. Or maybe I can build some of that functionality in and replace my external application. In many cases, because it's so easy to develop in Force.com, I can build the application internally with less effort than I could to build integration with an older legacy application. So that means if I start to say, well, maybe I'm going to take my CRM basics and have them inside of my Salesforce environment. Or maybe I'm going to take things that I don't normally put in a base CRM. I'm going to take advantage of the workflow and the business intelligence and analytics that's there. I'm going to use the content management and the activity management that's already available to me, instead of having these things done externally. In fact, I can even start to look at more complicated systems. Management by objective, incentive compensation, customer master are also things that I can either integrate through the user interface rather than pulling data in, or build some of that functionality internally and avoid having to replicate it. So again, by clever architecture and looking at where things reside, I can also reduce my integration overhead. Okay. So we've talked about kind of the 5 perceptions that people have about integration. Right? The first one is it's hard to integrate. Right? And we talked about we can avoid some of that by using integration appliances, by not having to take 20 or 30 different legacy applications and try to tie them to the cloud. I can integrate instead to a single integration engine internally, and there's lots of different ways we can approach that in different products, but tying one single connection. Right? We also talked that because I have a single connection, I can make it secure. I can apply the same kind of security measurements and metrics to it. I can use digital certificates. I can look at and have double validation. So, for example, if a transaction is coming in from the outside, it's common practice when we develop applications that if my integration appliance receives a connection from Salesforce requesting information, we're initiating another connection from there back out to Salesforce to verify that session, to make sure that it's valid so you don't get people who are going to try to spoof IP addresses, which is a common thing. But it's very easy to get around by having that double validation. When I receive a request, I'm going to go back to the originating application, verify that it's authentic, and then I'll establish the session and allow it to communicate with my back end. We talked about making integration more reliable. Right? One thing that happens also is when we establish these external connections, we talked about creating redundant systems, and you also get an added benefit. By using the appliance approach, what happens is when I'm communicating with another application, if that application is down, right, I can queue the messages here. So this can happen in an integration appliance, or if I've also got an enterprise message bus that supports queuing, if you're using something like Tibco, you can take the same approach there. So if that single connection isn't working, I gain reliability by, number one, being able to report it to my network and infrastructure management tools. And I can queue that message to make sure that I've got guaranteed delivery when that comes up. So my transaction might get delayed there, but it's going to go through. And I can count on it being reliable, even if part of the infrastructure is down, even if a firewall fails, or I lose a communication link, or I lose part of my integration infrastructure. That's all can be designed in such a way that it's easily recoverable and that you don't lose information or transactions along the way. We've also talked a little bit about, in some cases, how we've been able to manage large data volumes through the integration appliance. And I also certainly encourage people to attend the session tomorrow, Managing Large Data Volumes. I'll give you some more detail on how that's accomplished. And I said, again, we should first of all be really taking a hard look at our whole integration approach. Should we integrate? Just because in old client-server environment you had to integrate to avoid customization, to avoid building out new functionality. Sometimes we can avoid it, but even when we can't avoid it, because a lot of this is going to be a click and build approach to integration, we can eliminate a lot of the development time. So all we're really doing is traditional integration work, data mapping, data transformation, data cleansing. What I'm not doing is writing a lot of code. I'm not working with and trying to get my legacy staff who understand how to write SQL statements. I don't have to retrain them to go out and understand how to write service-oriented architecture, web service call. Right? They can work in the same SQL statements they're already comfortable working within, because now you're integrating with a local integration environment. You don't have to learn new technology. That holds down my cost. I can use my existing staff to do a lot of the integration work while still realizing a lot of the benefits of doing integration in the cloud. Some of the other things that we usually talk about when we're talking about integration success, right? How can I make sure my integration approach is going to work? Well, the first thing is really to focus on the process. If you're understanding, rather than looking at the existing applications and how they're technically connected, look at the business process, decide where things need to be implemented. I really strongly encourage people to do this. We've had a lot of savings in terms of integration complexity just by looking at my business process and saying, where can I do this work? Maybe I can do it completely in the cloud. Maybe it doesn't have to be done on my back end anymore. If I move it to the cloud, I save real advantages in having to do integration work and also reduce the maintenance of my existing applications. The other thing is to also be careful about separating your layers of information. A lot of people who have done some work on a cloud for a while know that it's really easy to build a user interface in Salesforce. So people really become focused on the UI. We can come in, we can create it quickly, just a couple of weeks, we'll throw it in there, we'll be done with it. Salesforce enables that, and it's great that it does. But some of the traditional planning processes that you do go through with integration still become very important here. So we need to separate out our data dictionary, consider that separately from the UI. We might use the UI to rapidly prototype it, but when we actually build the integration, we're going to take a more traditional approach and do detailed data mapping based on the data dictionary that comes out of that user interface discussion. We also talked about this a little bit before in terms of choosing the approach. Do I leverage packaged applications out of the App Exchange? Do I customize? Do I integrate? Again, the integration questions should be the third one on the list. Is there something else out there that I can use to move this functionality into my cloud application? Also, the other thing to look at is metrics. How am I going to measure and manage this process? A lot of things that we traditionally do in project management also apply here. But the cloud model changes it a little bit. A lot of these appliances and approaches we've talked about today are specific to cloud computing. Some of these tools you can buy on a subscription basis. I'm not worried about how many connectors I've got or or putting in expensive infrastructure. I'm not out counting how many CPUs I have in a server to do this. I've just got a single connection, and I turn it on, and I don't have to worry about the infrastructure. Things you shouldn't do, right? Number one, application architecture becomes paramount. If you design it right, you have to be aware of the Salesforce governance limits. There is a limit on how quickly you can move records in. There's some limits on how quickly you can run queries in that environment. There are limits on how much code you can run. But if you're working with people that have a lot of Salesforce experience, they'll understand these, can architect the application in a way to work around some of these limitations. One of the other things that we recommend is, you may find a lot of the tools that you do use in-house that you're traditionally doing development with. People go out and might be working with, for example, Toad or other products that are designed to work with SQL databases. And they do a great job with those. They may not work as well in the cloud environment. You're not going to have the same exposure to the data that you're accustomed to. There are, however, some cloud solutions that can enable or simulate access to information, so you can go in and run SQL queries and do things with cloud data just as if it was sitting in a traditional database. So looking at those and saying, when do we leverage those, when do we engage them, can we take advantage of these so we can still use the development tools that we're accustomed to? One thing that's also important is looking at data integrity. A lot of times if you've started out by designing the user interface to your application, that's how a lot of people start, with requirements and mapping them and developing the UI. That's a good approach, but at that point you need to stop and say, let's focus on data integrity. How am I going to ensure that the information I'm receiving is valid? How is it going to stay that way? And that requires some behind-the-scenes thinking. And I think this is a step a lot of people skip, is they focus on the UI and they're ready to, okay, it's built. Let's see how we can turn it on as quickly as possible. People think about, let's build the UI, let's write code, let's deploy it. It's harder to picture or position with the business necessarily sitting down doing a data integrity study. But it often can avoid problems down the long run. As you know, especially if you're using the CRM applications, and CRM data is king. So having high-quality data really is what's going to drive your return on investment in CRM in the first place. So that's a really important step to do that. One of the other things to do is, as you're doing your roadmap, a common mistake that we see people make is the significance of data isn't understood, the implications of how it's used. And this really goes back to also doing a proper data mapping and understand how the information is being used, who's using it, where it's coming from, and most important, how the records are owned, how they're going to be updated, and if you're moving it into a cloud environment, what happens when you start updating it in 2 locations, and how is that going to be synchronized. One of the other mistakes, of course, is we sometimes assume, you should work with a partner that's done it before, right? Integration is difficult, and it's easy out in the marketplace to find people that can help you build a UI. Finding partners that have a lot of integration experience takes a little more due diligence. We certainly recommend spending the time on that and making sure, if you are working with a partner, that they have experience in large enterprise integration projects. But at the end of the day, people say, well, what's the secret to the cloud? And the secret is that you're following the same process that you always did in the enterprise. You saw my all the flowers coming up and everything being beautiful, that slide earlier. You can take a lot of shortcuts because Salesforce allows you to. It's a great tool. You can build interfaces really, really quickly. But if you're doing it in an enterprise environment, all the stories you hear about people rolling out CRM in 2 weeks, it's not really true. You need to take a structured approach to integration, walk through the standard methodology that you use. You're still going to implement things faster, right, because of the way the tool enables it, because there's so much functionality built into it. But don't take shortcuts in integration. Walk through a standard project methodology. Do it the way you've been doing it with client server. That's one thing you need to do to ensure success. The tools are different. The processes are different. The timeline is different. The approach is the same. Okay. Now, this is a little Dreamforce pitch here. We're also asking that there's a survey that people can take for feedback on today's session. What I'd like to do is open the room up for questions. Now, if you fill out this survey here, Dreamforce is giving this away. I'd also like to mention in the back of the room, the Cognizant is also giving away a Kindle every day here at Dreamforce. And we've got a couple of people hiding in the back of the room that have some of the forms for that. So I'd love you to fill those out and stop by the booth and have a chance to win a Kindle. I'd also like to now open up the room for questions. And we've also got a couple of our solution architects have joined us here in the session and can answer questions that they may have. Does anybody have any questions? It's a small room, but okay.
The reverse integration or the reverse access from Salesforce into your data integration cast iron or device, is that a small piece of code that just sits and is available in the Salesforce environment, customer native, or just a link that you have to expose out to get that reverse integration?
Well, everything is a web service. So what we normally are doing is the integration appliance actually has a web service that's connected into Salesforce. And so we may put some Apex code inside Salesforce that basically initiates that external connection. When it goes and it basically talks to the appliance and says, I'd like to request some information. We then usually set up the integration point so it goes back through another connection with Salesforce to validate it, to make sure that it's not, someone's not trying a spoofing scam on us. So we're going to validate that it's a valid session. The integration appliance retrieves the information and passes it back to Salesforce. But when we do that, reps love it because it means they can get away from having to worry about VPN connections, which can be really problematic. And you're still talking about a secure connection. Everything going in both directions is encrypted, it's authenticated, and it really allows you to kind of step away from all the restrictions of VPN. Any other questions?
What kind of experience have you had trying to get as close as possible to real-time by synchronous replicating data?
Well, in terms of replicating data, you took. Okay. The question is how much experience do we have getting toward real-time replicated data? Now, when you're talking about replicated data, you mean between the legacy environment and Salesforce, or talking about like an active data center where it's copied to two locations?
I think being truly replicated even one step further where you're actually updating on both sides.
Yeah. So you can actually do that, and that's where something like a cast iron appliance is probably a good thing to be looking at. Because if you're moving information in both ways, first of all, the data onside of Salesforce, actually, they take care of the business continuity piece on their end. So they're, as you heard this morning in the keynote, right, they're backing that data up in pretty much real time to multiple data centers. So we're not worried about duplicating it from that perspective. But when we're tying it back to the application in the background, usually we can do that through synchronous transactions with the cast iron device. There are some restrictions. So for example, there's a limited amount of time you can wait for a transaction to complete. If you're doing a synchronous transaction, you could be positioning it so your user's sitting there waiting for that transaction to complete. It can take a while. Some of the risk is if the application is down on the back end and you've queued that message, the user may get frustrated, close their browser window, and launch it again. And that's something that we're working with Salesforce on, looking at some of the messaging and some of the ways to capture some of those events when you're working with Visualforce so that you can trap them and have a more elegant way of dealing with that. But we do have customers that are basically doing real-time synchronization on both sides. And Matt, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add to that. No? Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
You were talking about mistakes to the way you said pure data integrity. Did you mean data quality or data models or both?
Really think more data quality. In terms of people are usually looking at, when CRM system is saying, well, we're just going to integrate it, but we're not thinking about, well, what happens when it starts getting updated in two different places. And now that, data is more accessible through the cloud, also, you're really seeing better rep adoption. People are going to be out in the field updating information more often. But it also then becomes more important to focus on data quality because you're going to see a lot more information flowing into the system than you normally do, hopefully if you've done a good job implementing your CRM application. So unfortunately, a lot of people will focus on data quality in terms of now I'm migrating. So when I'm setting my CRM system up, I'm going to migrate data in and cleanse it. But once it's there, I'm just assuming that people are going to do the right thing and keep it up to date. That's usually not the case. So thinking about what's going to happen to the quality of that data as I'm designing my integration interface. Where do I validate it? Am I validating it in the front end with the cloud application? Is it being validated with back-end data? Can I use an integration interface to do that to help ensure data quality? And I'll give you one example. One of my clients, we implemented a customer master system in the back end. Then Salesforce environment was set up so that as people added contacts, it would go back to the customer master, verify whether or not this customer existed. If it did, it would populate all the contact information from the customer master. If not, it maintained it as a separate record and identified in the record that it did not exist in the customer master. So from a data quality point of view, we had two classes of customers. Ones are authenticated with the customer master, so we change them. We talk to the customer master and make sure it's current. Or if it doesn't exist in the customer master, then we know all the data quality has to be managed from within the CRM system itself. Okay. Any other questions? Yes?
Please use the microphone.
All right, sorry.
There. Do you have any insight about the bulkiness of data that comes out of the back end of an XML serializer? When we've done some proofs of concept like that, we've noticed that we'll take some data and run it through, get it ready, come out of SOAP Web Services. By the time it comes out of the XML serializer, it got overweight.
Yeah. Well, you're certainly adding a lot of, you have the potential of large data volumes to add a lot of overhead to it. Now, when you say overweight, you're talking about the data volume or the speed at which the data is coming? The size of the data? Yeah. I don't know if I have noticed that issue. I haven't really run into that too much, but I don't know if I certainly can have one of our architects talk to you offline about that. They can probably go into more detail than I can. Any other questions? Okay. I would suggest we're at booth 502 on the main floor. We've got a couple of our architects here, and so if you want to explore that question with them, I think they could dig into that a little more than I could. All right. Well, I thank everyone for coming today. Remember, we've got the surveys in the back. Don't forget those. Okay. Thank you.